Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform one final time before stepping into the Pentagon's most secure briefing room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished mahogany table where 12 of the nation's highest-ranking military officials would soon gather. At 34, Sarah had earned her place in this room through 15 years of distinguished naval service, multiple combat deployments, and an exceptional record in intelligence operations. Yet she knew that her relatively modest rank of commander often raised eyebrows among those who expected only admirals and generals at such high-level briefings. The morning had started like any other at her Arlington apartment. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 0500 hours, followed immediately by her usual routine of a 5-mile run along the Potomac River. The crisp November air helped clear her mind as she mentally rehearsed the intelligence briefing she would deliver today. Operation Midnight Sun, a classified mission involving potential terrorist activities in the Mediterranean, required immediate attention from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sarah's team had spent months gathering intelligence through various sources, and today's briefing could determine whether American forces would deploy to prevent a catastrophic attack. After her run, Sarah returned home to find her neighbor's cat, Whiskers, sitting patiently by her door. The elderly Mrs. Henderson next door often forgot to feed her pet, so Sarah had taken to keeping spare cat food in her apartment. As she poured the kibble into a small bowl, she reflected on how these simple acts of kindness helped ground her amid the complexities of military intelligence work. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister Emma, who lived in California and worked as a high school teacher. Emma's message contained a photo of her classroom decorated for Thanksgiving, along with a note saying how proud she was of Sarah's achievements. The drive to the Pentagon took longer than usual due to unexpected traffic on Interstate 395. Sarah used the extra time to review her notes one more time, knowing that any mistake during today's briefing could have serious consequences. She had discovered a pattern in intercepted communications that suggested 3 separate terrorist cells were planning coordinated attacks on American naval vessels in international waters. The evidence was compelling, but required immediate action to prevent potential loss of life. Upon arriving at the Pentagon, Sarah navigated through multiple security checkpoints, each requiring different levels of clearance. The building's maze-like corridors never failed to impress her, even after years of regular visits. She stopped by the intelligence office to collect the latest overnight reports from field operatives. 2 new pieces of information had arrived since her last review: satellite imagery showing unusual activity at a suspected training camp in Libya, and intercepted phone conversations between known terrorist operatives discussing timeline adjustments. As Sarah made her way to the briefing room, she encountered Captain Rodriguez from the Marine Corps Intelligence Division. They had worked together on a previous operation in Afghanistan, and Rodriguez always appreciated Sarah's thorough analysis and attention to detail. He mentioned that today's meeting included some officials who might not be familiar with her background, suggesting she should be prepared for questions about her qualifications. Sarah appreciated the warning, but felt confident in her preparation and expertise. The briefing room gradually filled with high-ranking officials, including Admiral Thompson, the Chief of Naval Operations, General Harrison from the Army, and several other admirals and generals whose faces Sarah recognized from previous meetings. The atmosphere was tense, reflecting the serious nature of the intelligence they were about to discuss. Sarah positioned herself near the presentation screen, organizing her materials one final time before beginning her briefing. Just as Sarah was about to call the meeting to order, the door opened and in walked Lieutenant Commander Jake "Shark" Davidson, a Navy SEAL with a reputation for both exceptional combat skills and an unfortunate tendency toward arrogance. Sarah had encountered Davidson twice before at joint operations briefings, and both times he had made dismissive comments about intelligence officers who played it safe behind desks while real warriors did the fighting. His nickname, Shark, came from his aggressive tactics during SEAL operations, but Sarah suspected it could just as easily refer to his personality. Davidson scanned the room, nodding respectfully to the admirals and generals before his gaze settled on Sarah. A slight smirk crossed his face as he took a seat directly across from where she stood. Sarah noticed his expression, but maintained her professional composure, knowing that any reaction would only feed into whatever game he planned to play. She had dealt with similar attitudes throughout her career and learned that the best response was always to let her work speak for itself. Admiral Thompson called the meeting to order, and Sarah began her presentation with a comprehensive overview of Operation Midnight Sun. She explained how her team had identified patterns in terrorist communications over the past 6 months, leading to the discovery of 3 interconnected cells operating across the Mediterranean region. Her presentation included detailed maps, intercepted communications, financial transaction records, and satellite imagery that painted a clear picture of an imminent threat to American naval forces. As Sarah detailed the evidence supporting her analysis, she noticed Davidson occasionally whispering to the officer next to him and making subtle facial expressions that suggested skepticism. When she paused to take questions about the timeline of the proposed attacks, Davidson raised his hand with exaggerated formality. "Commander Mitchell," he began, emphasizing her rank in a way that seemed designed to highlight its relative modesty compared to others in the room. "This is all very impressive desk work, but how do we know these communications aren't just chatter? I mean, with respect to your rank and experience level, have you ever actually been in the field to verify intelligence like this?" The room fell silent as everyone processed Davidson's thinly veiled challenge to Sarah's credibility. Admiral Thompson's jaw tightened slightly, and General Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but maintained her steady tone as she prepared to respond to what was clearly an attempt to undermine her authority based on both her rank and gender. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson," Sarah replied calmly, "I appreciate your question about field verification. In fact, the intelligence we're discussing today has been corroborated through multiple sources, including human intelligence assets that I personally recruited and managed during my deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The pattern analysis I've presented represents not just communications intercepts, but also financial intelligence, movement patterns, and behavioral analysis that together create a comprehensive threat picture." Davidson leaned back in his chair with a dismissive gesture. "Look, Commander, I'm sure you've done your homework, but intelligence analysis and actual combat operations are 2 very different things. Some of us have been on the ground facing these terrorists directly, while others have been, well, analyzing from a safe distance." The tension in the room became palpable as Davidson's comments crossed the line from professional skepticism to personal disrespect. Sarah felt the eyes of every official in the room watching to see how she would handle this challenge to her expertise and authority. She knew that her response would not only determine the credibility of her current briefing, but could also impact her future effectiveness in similar high-level meetings. Admiral Thompson began to speak, clearly intending to restore order to the meeting, but Sarah gently raised her hand to indicate she preferred to handle the situation herself. She understood that while Thompson's intervention might end the immediate confrontation, it could also reinforce the perception that she needed protection from senior male officers rather than being capable of defending her own professional credibility. "Lieutenant Commander," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady and professional despite the obvious provocation, "I understand the importance of field experience in validating intelligence analysis. Perhaps we should focus on the specific evidence I've presented and discuss whether you see any tactical concerns with the proposed response options rather than debating the relative merits of different types of military service." Davidson's smirk widened as he seemed to interpret her diplomatic response as weakness rather than professionalism. With all due respect, Commander, when lives are on the line, we need someone with real operational experience making these kinds of assessments. I've led dozens of missions based on intelligence reports, and I can tell you that analysts sometimes miss crucial details that only become apparent when you're actually in the field facing the enemy. The room remained tense as other officials exchanged glances. Clearly uncomfortable with Davidson's persistent challenges, but uncertain about how to intervene without escalating the situation further, Sarah realized that Davidson was not going to back down from his position and that she needed to address his concerns more directly while maintaining the professional decorum appropriate for such a high-level meeting. Sarah looked directly at Davidson, her expression remaining calm and confident despite the obvious tension in the room. She had faced similar challenges throughout her career and knew that backing down would only embolden future attempts to undermine her authority based on gender or rank rather than merit. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson," she said, "I respect your extensive field experience and the risks you've taken in service to our country. However, the intelligence I'm presenting today comes from multiple verified sources, including assets I've personally managed in combat zones. If you have specific concerns about the evidence or methodology, I'm happy to address them. Otherwise, I suggest we focus on the immediate threat and the response options available to us." Davidson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of the meeting and reveal information about Commander Sarah Mitchell that even her closest colleagues in the room did not know. The door to the briefing room opened quietly, and Admiral Rebecca Hayes stepped inside. At 62, Admiral Hayes commanded respect throughout the entire military establishment. Her silver hair was pulled back in a precise bun, and her uniform displayed ribbons representing 3 decades of distinguished service, including 2 combat deployments and leadership roles in several major military operations. What made her entrance particularly significant was not just her rank as a 4-star admiral, but her reputation as one of the most decorated female officers in Navy history. Admiral Hayes surveyed the room briefly, her sharp eyes taking in the obvious tension between Commander Mitchell and Lieutenant Commander Davidson. She had arrived slightly late due to an emergency phone call from the Secretary of Defense, but the uncomfortable atmosphere told her she had missed something important. Hayes knew Sarah Mitchell's reputation well, though she suspected few people in the room understood the full extent of the younger officer's background and achievements. "I apologize for my late arrival," Admiral Hayes said, addressing the room in general but making eye contact with Sarah. "I hope I haven't missed anything crucial about Operation Midnight Sun." Admiral Thompson quickly brought Hayes up to speed on the intelligence briefing, though he diplomatically avoided mentioning the tension that had just unfolded between Davidson and Sarah. However, Hayes was an experienced leader who could read a room's dynamics within seconds. She noticed Davidson's defensive posture, Sarah's controlled but tense expression, and the uncomfortable silence from other officials who clearly wished they were anywhere else. "Commander Mitchell," Admiral Hayes said, "please continue with your assessment. I'm particularly interested in your analysis of the terrorist cell's communication patterns and how you identified the connection between the 3 groups." Sarah felt a wave of relief at having Admiral Hayes in the room. She had worked with Hayes 2 years earlier on a classified operation involving intelligence sharing with Allied forces, and she knew the Admiral valued competence over rank and results over politics. Sarah resumed her briefing, detailing how her team had used advanced cryptographic analysis to identify coded messages hidden within seemingly innocent social media posts and email communications. As Sarah explained the sophisticated nature of the terrorist communication network, Admiral Hayes asked several probing questions that demonstrated both her intelligence background and her understanding of modern warfare tactics. The questions were challenging but respectful. focused entirely on the substance of the intelligence rather than Sarah's qualifications to present it. Other officials in the room began participating more actively in the discussion, following Hayes's lead in treating Sarah as the subject matter expert she was. Davidson remained quiet during this exchange, but his body language suggested growing frustration with the attention and respect being shown to Sarah's analysis. When Sarah finished explaining the technical aspects of the intelligence gathering, Davidson seized what he apparently thought was an opportunity to reassert his earlier challenges. "Admiral Hayes," Davidson said, standing up slightly in his chair to address the senior officer, "I've been expressing some concerns about relying too heavily on intelligence analysis without sufficient field verification. Commander Mitchell clearly has strong analytical skills, but in my experience, desk-based intelligence sometimes misses crucial operational realities that only become apparent when you're actually engaging with the enemy." Admiral Hayes turned to look at Davidson with an expression that immediately made him realize he might have made a serious error in judgment. Her voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge that suggested she was not pleased with what she had just heard. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson," Hayes said slowly, "are you suggesting that Commander Mitchell's intelligence analysis is inadequate because she lacks field experience?" Davidson, apparently not recognizing the warning signs in Hayes's tone, doubled down on his position. "Admiral, I'm just saying that some of us have been in actual combat situations, leading missions based on intelligence reports. We've seen how things can go wrong when analysts make assumptions about enemy behavior without having faced that enemy directly. I think we need to consider the source when evaluating this kind of intelligence assessment." The room became even quieter than before, if that was possible. Admiral Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, while General Harrison stared at Davidson with an expression of disbelief. Admiral Hayes, however, maintained her composed demeanor while fixing Davidson with a stare that would have made a great white shark reconsider its lunch plans. "I see," Admiral Hayes said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of command experience. "Lieutenant Commander, I think you may be operating under some incorrect assumptions about Commander Mitchell's background and qualifications." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized where this conversation was heading. There were aspects of her military record that remained classified, operations she had participated in that could never be publicly acknowledged. She had hoped to handle Davidson's challenges without having to reveal information that was meant to remain secret. But Admiral Hayes clearly had other plans. "Admiral," Sarah said quietly, "I don't think it's necessary to discuss classified aspects of my service record to address Lieutenant Commander Davidson's concerns." Hayes looked at Sarah with an expression that was both understanding and determined. "Commander, I believe it is absolutely necessary. This officer has questioned your credibility based on assumptions about your experience level. Those assumptions are not only incorrect, but potentially harmful to military operations if they influence how other officers view intelligence assessments." Admiral Hayes turned back to Davidson, who was beginning to look less confident than he had moments earlier. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson, are you familiar with Operation Desert Storm?" Davidson nodded, clearly confused about where Hayes was going with this line of questioning. "Yes, Admiral, though I was still in high school when that conflict occurred." "What about Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan?" Hayes continued. "I participated in several missions during that operation between 2010 and 2015, Davidson replied, his voice showing the first signs of uncertainty. "And Operation Iraqi Freedom?" "I served 2 deployments during that operation as well," Davidson said, though his confident tone was fading rapidly. Admiral Hayes nodded slowly. "Commander Mitchell," she said, turning to Sarah, "would you please tell Lieutenant Commander Davidson about your service record during those operations?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to reveal would fundamentally change how everyone in the room viewed her background and capabilities. For years, She had preferred to let her current work speak for itself, rather than trading on past achievements. But Admiral Hayes was clearly not going to let Davidson's challenges go unanswered. "Admiral," Sarah said reluctantly, "during Operation Iraqi Freedom, I served with Marine Force reconnaissance units conducting deep penetration intelligence-gathering missions behind enemy lines. During Operation Enduring Freedom, I worked with Special Operations Command coordinating intelligence and tactical operations in the mountainous regions along the Pakistan border." Davidson's expression began to change as he processed what Sarah was telling him, but Hayes was not finished. "Commander, please tell us about your decorations and commendations from those operations." Sarah's discomfort was obvious, but she continued under Admiral Hayes's direct instruction. "I received the Silver Star for actions during a reconnaissance mission in Iraq, where our team was compromised and came under heavy fire while extracting a high-value intelligence asset. The Bronze Star with Combat 5 for actions during multiple combat operations in Afghanistan, and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during a Taliban ambush in the Kunar province." The room fell completely silent as the implications of what Sarah had just revealed sank in. Davidson's face had gone pale as he realized that the officer he had been questioning about field experience was actually more experienced in direct combat operations than he was. The Silver Star is the third highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for exceptional gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Admiral Thompson leaned forward in his chair, his voice filled with respect. "Commander Mitchell, I had no idea about your special operations background. That information isn't included in the standard briefing materials for these meetings." General Harrison nodded in agreement. "The Silver Star and Bronze Star with Combat 5 represent extraordinary service, Commander. Those decorations are not awarded lightly." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at having her personal military record discussed so publicly. She had always believed that her current performance should matter more than past achievements, and she was uncomfortable with the attention her decorations were receiving. However, she also understood that Admiral Hayes had revealed this information to prevent future challenges to her credibility based on unfounded assumptions. "Thank you, sirs," Sarah said quietly. "I prefer to focus on the current mission rather than past operations." Admiral Hayes was not finished, however. She turned back to Davidson, who looked like he wished he could disappear through the floor. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson, do you have any other concerns about Commander Mitchell's qualifications to provide intelligence assessments based on field experience?" Davidson opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by obvious embarrassment and the growing realization that he had made a serious error in judgment. The other officers in the room were watching him expectantly, waiting to see how he would respond to the revelation that the officer he had been dismissing as inexperienced actually had more combat experience and higher decorations for valor than most people in the room. Admiral Hayes allowed the silence to stretch for several uncomfortable seconds before continuing. "Commander Mitchell, there's one more aspect of your background that I think Lieutenant Commander Davidson should understand before we continue with this briefing." Sarah looked at Hayes with surprise and growing apprehension. She thought they had already covered the most significant aspects of her military record, but Hayes's expression suggested there was something else, something that even Sarah might not expect to be revealed in this setting. "Admiral," Sarah said carefully, "I'm not sure what other aspects of my service record would be relevant to today's discussion." Hayes smiled slightly, the first time her expression had softened since Davidson began his challenges. "Commander, I think it's time these officers understood exactly who has been providing them with this intelligence analysis." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as everyone waited to hear what additional revelation Admiral Hayes was about to share. Davidson looked like he was preparing for the worst, while the other senior officers leaned forward with obvious curiosity about what they were about to learn about the unassuming commander who had just been revealed to be a highly decorated combat veteran. Admiral Hayes walked slowly around the conference table, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. Every pair of eyes followed her movement as she approached the wall where several framed photographs displayed various military operations and ceremonies from the past decade. She stopped in front of a particular photograph that showed a group of military officers standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, all wearing dress uniforms decorated with ribbons and medals. "Gentlemen," Admiral Hayes said, pointing to the photograph, "this picture was taken 3 years ago during a ceremony honoring recipients of the Medal of Honor and other high military decorations. Most of you probably recognize several faces in this photograph, including former Secretary of Defense Morrison and General Patterson, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time." The officers in the room studied the photograph with interest, though none of them could immediately understand why Admiral Hayes was showing them this particular image. Davidson, still reeling from the earlier revelations about Sarah's combat record, looked at the photo with growing confusion and apprehension. Sarah, however, had gone completely pale as she realized what Admiral Hayes was about to reveal. She had never wanted her most significant military achievement to become public knowledge, partly because it involved classified operations, and partly because she believed it would change how people treated her professionally. She preferred to be evaluated based on her current work, rather than past heroics. "Admiral Hayes," Sarah said quietly, "please, I don't think this is necessary for the current discussion." Hayes turned to look at Sarah with an expression that was both sympathetic and determined. "Commander Mitchell, I understand your preference for privacy, but Lieutenant Commander Davidson has made it clear that he believes your lack of field experience makes you unqualified to provide intelligence assessments to this body. Under those circumstances, I believe these officers deserve to know exactly who they're dealing with." Admiral Hayes pointed to a figure in the photograph who appeared to be a younger woman in dress blues, standing between two four-star generals. The woman's face was partially obscured by the angle of the photograph, but her posture and the ribbons on her uniform indicated she was clearly someone of significant importance. "This officer," Hayes continued, "was being honored that day for actions that saved the lives of an entire special operations team during what became known as the Kandahar Valley Incident. The operation involved a joint Navy-Marine intelligence gathering mission that was compromised when Taliban forces launched a coordinated attack using insider information provided by a compromised local ally." The room remained completely silent as Admiral Hayes continued her explanation. "When the Special Operations Team found themselves surrounded and outgunned in a valley with no clear escape route, this officer took command of the situation and coordinated a fighting withdrawal that lasted 14 hours across some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. She personally carried 2 wounded Marines to safety while directing air support and managing communications with extraction teams." General Harrison leaned forward, studying the photograph more carefully. "Admiral, are you saying that Commander Mitchell was involved in the Kandahar Valley operation? I remember reading about that incident in the classified after-action reports. The officer who led that operation received the Medal of Honor." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that her deepest secret was about to be revealed to a room full of people who would never look at her the same way again. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, reserved for acts of valor that go far beyond the call of duty. Only a handful of people receive this decoration each decade, and fewer than 5 women had ever received it in the nation's history. Admiral Hayes nodded slowly. "Commander Sarah Mitchell is the officer in this photograph. She received the Medal of Honor from the President for her actions during the Kandahar Valley incident, though the details of her specific actions remain classified. What I can tell you is that 12 American service members are alive today because of her courage, tactical expertise, and leadership under impossible circumstances." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Every officer present understood the significance of the Medal of Honor and what it represented in terms of exceptional valor and sacrifice. Admiral Thompson's jaw dropped open, while General Harrison stared at Sarah with a mixture of awe and respect. The other senior officers around the table began looking at Sarah with completely different eyes, realizing they were in the presence of one of the most decorated heroes in modern American military history. Davidson, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His face had gone from pale to red as the full magnitude of his error became apparent. He had spent the entire morning questioning the combat experience and qualifications of a Medal of Honor recipient, one of the most highly decorated officers in the entire military. His arrogant comments about desk work and safe distance analysis now seemed not just inappropriate, but almost insulting to someone who had demonstrated the highest levels of courage and leadership in actual combat. Admiral Hayes was not finished, however. There's more that these officers should understand about Commander Mitchell's background and why her intelligence assessments carry special weight in situations like this. Sarah looked at Admiral Hayes with pleading eyes, hoping the Admiral would not reveal any more classified information about her service record. She had already shared more than she ever wanted about her military background, and she was concerned about how much additional attention this revelation would bring to her current work. "Admiral," Sarah said softly, "I think Lieutenant Commander Davidson understands my qualifications now. Perhaps we could return to discussing Operation Midnight Sun and the immediate threat we're facing." Hayes shook her head firmly. "Commander, I'm afraid Lieutenant Commander Davidson and the other officers in this room need to understand the full context of your expertise before we proceed with discussing response options to this terrorist threat." Admiral Hayes walked back to her position at the conference table and looked around the room at each officer in turn. "What most of you don't know is that Commander Mitchell's Medal of Honor was awarded not just for her courage during the firefight, but for her intelligence work that prevented a much larger terrorist attack. The mission that went wrong in Kandahar Valley was actually the final phase of a months-long intelligence operation that Mitchell had designed and executed almost entirely on her own." The room remained transfixed as Hayes continued her explanation. Commander Mitchell had identified a network of Taliban and Al-Qaeda operatives who were planning coordinated attacks on 3 different American bases throughout Afghanistan. Her intelligence work uncovered the plot, identified the key players, and developed the operational plan that ultimately prevented what could have been the worst terrorist attack on American forces since the beginning of the war. General Harrison whistled softly. "The Kandahar Valley operation was part of a larger counterterrorism mission. I remember the briefings about prevented attacks during that time period, but I never knew about the connection to the Medal of Honor action." Admiral Hayes nodded. The intelligence work and the combat action were all part of the same operation. Commander Mitchell not only identified the terrorist network through brilliant analysis, but she also personally participated in the dangerous missions required to gather human intelligence and verify the threat. When the final mission was compromised, she led the fighting withdrawal that saved her team and preserved the intelligence that prevented the larger attacks. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and praise being directed toward her. She had joined the military to serve her country, not to become a celebrity or to have her personal achievements used to settle petty disputes with arrogant colleagues. However, she also understood that Admiral Hayes was making a broader point about respecting competence and experience regardless of rank or gender. Admiral Thompson finally found his voice. "Commander Mitchell, why isn't this information included in your standard biographical materials for these briefings? If officers understood your background and achievements, there would never be questions about your credibility or expertise." Sarah looked uncomfortable as she considered how to answer. "Sir, I've always believed that my current work should speak for itself. I don't want other officers to treat me differently because of past achievements, and I certainly don't want anyone to think I'm trading on my decorations rather than demonstrating current competence." Admiral Hayes smiled at Sarah's response. "Commander, that attitude is exactly why you received the Medal of Honor in the first place. However, in this case, your modesty has created a situation where uninformed officers feel free to question your qualifications based on assumptions rather than facts. All eyes turned to Davidson, who had remained silent throughout the entire revelation. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by obvious mortification as he realized the magnitude of his error. Not only had he questioned the credentials of a Medal of Honor recipient, but he had done so in front of the most senior military leadership, making himself look both ignorant and disrespectful. Admiral Hayes looked directly at Davidson. "Lieutenant Commander Davidson, do you have any further questions about Commander Mitchell's qualifications to provide intelligence assessments based on field experience?" Davidson slowly stood up from his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. The room watched in complete silence as he walked around the conference table toward where Sarah was standing. When he reached her position, he came to attention in a formal military posture. "Commander Mitchell," Davidson said, his voice filled with genuine remorse and respect, "I owe you a sincere apology. My comments this morning were inappropriate, disrespectful, and based on ignorant assumptions about your background and qualifications. I was completely wrong to question your expertise, and I ask for your forgiveness for my unprofessional behavior." Before Sarah could respond, something extraordinary happened. Admiral Hayes stood up and came to attention, rendering a formal salute to Sarah. The gesture was particularly meaningful because Hayes significantly outranked Sarah, making the salute a powerful symbol of respect for Sarah's achievements and service, rather than a recognition of rank. Admiral Thompson immediately stood and followed suit, rendering his own formal salute to Sarah. Within seconds, General Harrison and every other senior officer in the room had risen from their chairs and were standing at attention, saluting the Medal of Honor recipient who had been quietly serving among them without seeking recognition or special treatment. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the unexpected display of respect from officers who significantly outranked her. The formal salutes from admirals and generals represented an extraordinary gesture of honor that she had never experienced and had certainly never expected during what was supposed to be a routine intelligence briefing. The moment stretched for several seconds as the most senior military leaders in the room maintained their salutes, acknowledging not just Sarah's past achievements, but also the courage and humility she had shown in keeping those achievements private while continuing to serve with distinction. Davidson remained at attention as well, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine respect and understanding. Finally, Sarah returned the salute, completing the formal exchange. As the senior officers slowly returned to their seats, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The tension and conflict that had dominated the earlier part of the meeting had been replaced by a profound sense of respect and unity. Admiral Hayes spoke first, as everyone settled back into their chairs. "Now that we've established Commander Mitchell's qualifications beyond any possible doubt, I suggest we focus our attention on the terrorist threat she's identified and the response options available to us." Sarah took a deep breath, grateful that the focus was finally returning to the mission at hand. "Thank you all," she said simply. "Now, if we could return to Operation Midnight Sun, I believe we have some critical decisions to make about protecting our naval forces in the Mediterranean." As the meeting resumed with renewed focus on the intelligence briefing, Davidson remained quiet but attentive, clearly having learned a valuable lesson about making assumptions and showing respect for fellow officers regardless of rank or gender. The other senior officers engaged with Sarah's analysis with obvious respect and attention, asking detailed questions about tactical options and operational timelines. The terrorist threat that Sarah had identified was indeed serious and immediate. Over the following weeks, her intelligence work and the decisions made in that Pentagon briefing room would prevent multiple attacks on American naval vessels, saving countless lives and demonstrating once again why experience, expertise, and respect matter more than rank or personal prejudices in military operations. Sarah continued her distinguished career, eventually receiving promotion to Admiral herself. But she never forgot the lesson of that morning when a SEAL's arrogance was transformed into respect through the power of truth and the courage of leaders like Admiral Hayes, who insisted on recognizing merit wherever they found it.